April 7th, 1945. The afternoon sun filtered through broken windows of a schoolhouse in the small Bavarian town of Schweinfurt, casting long shadows across dusty wooden floors where German civilians huddled together, awaiting their fate. Outside, the rumble of American tanks had finally fallen silent after 3 days of intense operations to secure the region. Among the 200 or so townspeople gathered in the makeshift assembly point, whispers spread like wildfire when word came that the occupying forces would include soldiers they had been taught to fear above all others. What these German civilians believed in that moment, fed by years of relentless ideological conditioning, would clash so dramatically with reality in the coming hours that some would later describe it as the moment their entire understanding of the world shattered like glass. Before we dive into this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you're watching from, and it really helps support the channel. This is the story of how propaganda's most absurd lies crumbled in the face of simple human decency, and how the reactions of African American soldiers to unthinkable prejudice would transform not just a town, but challenge the very foundations of hate itself. The spring of 1945 marked a pivotal turning point in the European theater of operations. Allied forces were pushing deep into German territory from multiple directions, with the Western Front advancing rapidly through formerly contested regions. The Sixth Army Group, comprising both American and French units, had crossed the Rhine River in late March and was now systematically liberating towns and cities throughout southern Germany. Among these forces were segregated units of the United States Armed Forces, including several all-black combat and support battalions that had proven themselves repeatedly, despite facing discrimination both at home and within their own military structure. The 761st Tank Battalion, an all-black armored unit that had landed at Omaha Beach in October of 1944, had fought through France and into Germany alongside white infantry divisions. The 320th Barrage Balloon Battalion, which had been the only black combat unit to land on D-Day itself, had transitioned to security and logistics roles as the front moved eastward. Numerous quartermaster, transportation, and engineering battalions composed of African American personnel were essential to keeping supply lines functioning across the devastated European landscape. By April of 45, approximately 500,000 black servicemen were stationed in the European theater of operations, though they remained largely segregated from their white counterparts due to military policies that reflected the racial attitudes of the era. Sergeant Isaiah Morrison of the 384th Port Battalion had joined the military in 1942 from his home in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. A former railroad porter who had spent his pre-military years ensuring white passengers traveled in comfort while enduring constant indignities, Morrison had volunteered for service despite knowing he would face continued segregation in uniform. At 32 years old, he was older than many of his fellow soldiers, his face already marked by lines that spoke of experiences beyond his years. His unit had been reassigned from port operations to occupation duties as combat operations wound down, and he now found himself part of a provisional detachment ordered to help secure and administer newly liberated territories. Private First Class James Caldwell, barely 21 years old, had grown up in rural Georgia, where the weight of oppression had been a constant companion since childhood. Despite this, or perhaps because of it, he had volunteered immediately after Pearl Harbor, seeing military service as a potential pathway to dignity and respect. His mother had wept when he left, not from fear of combat but from terror of what white soldiers might do to her son in uniform. Caldwell had initially been assigned to a labor battalion, spending 2 years loading ships and digging latrines, before finally being allowed to serve in a combat support role. He arrived in Europe in January of 45, just in time to witness the final push into Germany itself. Corporal David Washington had been a schoolteacher in Chicago before the conflict, one of the relatively few African Americans who had managed to obtain a college education in the 1930s. His intelligence and education made him simultaneously valuable to the military and threatening to white officers who found his articulate manner unsettling. He had been promoted to corporal despite his qualifications warranting higher rank, and he had learned to navigate the complex dynamics of military segregation with a combination of quiet competence and strategic deference. At 28, Washington carried himself with a dignity that no amount of discrimination could entirely diminish. Technical Sergeant Robert Hayes had seen combat in North Africa and Italy before the unit's redeployment to France. A mechanic from Detroit who could repair anything with an engine, Hayes had kept his battalion's vehicles running through conditions that defeated many white motor pool sergeants with better equipment and resources. He was stocky and powerfully built, with hands scarred from years of working with machinery and a laugh that could fill a room. Despite facing constant obstacles, Hayes maintained an almost supernatural optimism that both inspired and puzzled his fellow soldiers. Lieutenant Marcus Thompson was one of the relatively rare black officers, having graduated from Howard University and completed officer candidate school despite facing hostility that would have broken lesser men. At 26, he commanded a platoon of 60 men in a transportation company, responsible for moving supplies from railheads to forward positions. Thompson walked a perpetual tightrope, needing to maintain authority over his own men while carefully managing relationships with white officers who often outranked him but possessed a fraction of his education and capability. He had developed a careful diplomatic style, knowing that any perceived arrogance could result in his immediate removal from command. These 5 men, along with approximately 150 other African-American soldiers, had been assigned to occupation duties in the Schweinfurt region. The town itself had been heavily damaged during multiple aerial campaigns due to its significance as a ball-bearing manufacturing center. Before the conflict, Schweinfurt had produced nearly half of Germany's ball bearings, essential components for everything from aircraft to tanks. Allied strategic planners had identified the town as critical to Germany's industrial capacity, resulting in devastating aerial operations in 1943 that had destroyed much of the industrial infrastructure and killed thousands of civilians. By April of 45, Schweinfurt was a shadow of its former self. Entire neighborhoods lay in ruins, with only skeletal walls remaining where homes and shops had once stood. The population, which had numbered nearly 50,000 before hostilities began, had been reduced to perhaps 30,000 through a combination of casualties, evacuation, and flight. Those who remained were primarily women, children, and elderly men, as virtually all able-bodied males had been conscripted into military service. Food was scarce, medical supplies nearly non-existent, and the infrastructure for daily life had largely collapsed. The civilian population had endured years of ideological conditioning that had only intensified as Germany's fortunes declined. From 1933 onward, the regime had systematically promoted racist ideology through every available channel, including schools, newspapers, radio broadcasts, public rallies, and cultural productions. Children had been taught racial theories as scientific fact, with elaborate charts and measurements, purporting to demonstrate the superiority of some groups and the inferiority of others. By the time hostilities erupted across Europe, an entire generation had reached adulthood, having never been exposed to perspectives that contradicted the official narrative. Propaganda regarding African Americans had been particularly virulent and absurd. Official publications had depicted black people as subhuman, more closely related to primates than to other humans. Some materials had literally claimed that African Americans possessed tails, that they were cannibals who would prey upon white populations, that they were incapable of civilized behavior, and that their presence in the occupying forces represented a deliberate American strategy of humiliation and terror. These lies had been repeated so frequently and through so many channels that many German civilians, particularly those in smaller towns with no direct experience of racial diversity, had accepted them as established truth. Frau Elisabeth Weber, a 43-year-old widow whose husband had perished during operations on the Eastern Front in 1943, had spent the final months of the conflict struggling to keep her 2 daughters alive. She had been a schoolteacher before circumstances forced her into factory work, and she considered herself educated and rational. Yet even she had absorbed the constant messaging about racial hierarchies, though some part of her mind had always questioned the more extreme claims. When word spread that black soldiers would be among the occupying forces, she felt a complex mixture of fear, curiosity, and something she could not quite name, but might have been shame at her own indoctrinated beliefs. Her neighbor, Frau Margarete Schulz, age 38, had worked in one of the ball-bearing factories until Allied operations had reduced the facility to rubble. She had 3 children ranging from 6 to 14 years old, and she had spent the final years of the conflict in a state of constant anxiety about their survival. Schulz had been more thoroughly convinced by official propaganda than Weber, partly because her limited education had left her with few tools to critically evaluate the information she received. The prospect of black soldiers in their town filled her with genuine terror, and she had seriously considered fleeing into the countryside despite having nowhere to go and no means of survival. Greta Hoffmann was only 19 years old, born the year after the regime had taken power. She had never known any reality except the ideological framework she had been taught from earliest childhood. Her education had been interrupted when her school had been converted to a military hospital, and she had spent the past year working as a nurse's aide, witnessing horrors that no teenager should have to see. The young men she had grown up with were nearly all gone, either deceased or missing in action on distant fronts. Hoffmann carried herself with a brittle toughness that barely concealed deep trauma, and she viewed the approaching occupation with a combination of resignation and defiant anger. The town's remaining leadership had largely collapsed in the chaos of the conflict's final weeks. The mayor had fled several days before Allied forces arrived, taking with him what remained of official records and supplies. The ranking military officer, an elderly colonel who had been recalled from retirement to command the local defense force, had wisely chosen surrender over pointless resistance that would only have resulted in further civilian casualties. This colonel, Heinrich Müller, aged 61, had fought in the first global conflict of the 20th century and had no illusions about Germany's current situation. He had ordered his ragtag militia of teenage boys and old men to lay down their weapons, probably saving dozens of lives through this decision. When American forces had entered Schweinfurt on April 4th, they had encountered only sporadic resistance from a few fanatics who were quickly neutralized. The main American units that had conducted the initial operations were white infantry and armor divisions that had pushed through rapidly, securing strategic points and moving on toward their next objectives. In their wake came the occupation forces, whose job was to establish order, prevent guerrilla activity, ensure civilians received basic necessities, and begin the complex process of denazification and reconstruction. It was early on the morning of April 7th when the black soldiers arrived in Schweinfurt. They came in a convoy of trucks and jeeps, their vehicles worn from months of hard use, but still functional thanks to the tireless work of mechanics like Sergeant Hayes. As the convoy rolled through the ruined streets, civilian faces appeared in windows and doorways, watching with expressions ranging from fear to curiosity to barely concealed hostility. Sergeant Morrison sat in the lead truck, observing the devastation with complicated emotions. He had seen similar scenes in France and Western Germany, cities reduced to rubble by the machinery of total conflict. Part of him felt satisfaction that those who had initiated this catastrophe were now experiencing its consequences. Another part, the part shaped by his mother's Christianity and his own essential humanity, felt pity for the civilians who had been caught up in decisions they had little power to influence. And beneath both these reactions lay a deeper awareness that the people staring at him from those ruins had been taught to view him as less than human, a realization that created a familiar ache he had carried his entire life. The convoy came to a halt in the central square, or what remained of it. The town hall had been reduced to a burned-out shell, its roof collapsed inward, and its walls blackened by fire. The church across the square had fared slightly better, losing only its steeple to aerial bombardment. Around the square's perimeter, a few buildings remained relatively intact, and it was toward these that Lieutenant Thompson directed his men to establish their headquarters and billets. As the soldiers dismounted from their vehicles and began unloading equipment, a crowd of civilians gradually assembled at a cautious distance. There were perhaps 200 people, mostly women and children with a scattering of elderly men. They watched in silence as the black soldiers moved about their tasks with professional efficiency, setting up communication equipment, establishing guard posts, and beginning to organize the supplies they had brought. Private Caldwell felt the weight of hundreds of eyes upon him and fought the urge to meet their stares. He had experienced this before, in towns in France where locals had emerged to watch the American forces arrive. But there was something different in these German faces, something beyond ordinary curiosity about occupying forces. There was fear, certainly, but also a kind of shocked confusion, as if the mere fact of his existence contradicted something fundamental they had believed. Frau Weber stood at the edge of the crowd, her daughters pressed close against her sides. She watched as a tall soldier with sergeant's stripes directed younger men in setting up what appeared to be a field kitchen. His movements were calm and competent, his voice when he spoke carrying authority without harshness. She had expected, though she now felt foolish admitting it even to herself, something more brutish, more animalistic. What she observed instead was a scene of ordinary military efficiency, no different from what she might have witnessed with any group of soldiers. Beside her, Frau Schultz whispered in a voice tight with anxiety, "Do you see? They look almost normal." The comment revealed the depth of the propaganda's penetration. These were women who had been convinced that African Americans were essentially a different species, and the simple observation that they looked and behaved like ordinary human beings was genuinely surprising to them. Young Greta Hoffmann stood slightly apart from the older women, her arms crossed defensively across her chest. She had volunteered to come to the square specifically to observe the occupiers, driven by a mixture of defiance and a morbid curiosity she would not have admitted aloud. Like the others, she found herself struggling to reconcile what she had been taught with what she was witnessing. The soldiers moved about their duties with casual professionalism, speaking to each other in accented but clear English, occasionally laughing at some shared joke. It was Corporal Washington who first noticed the intensity of the civilian observation. He had been organizing supplies near one of the trucks when he became aware that he was the subject of particularly fixed attention from a group of women. He glanced up and found himself meeting the eyes of Frau Weber, who immediately looked away, her face reddening with embarrassment at being caught staring. Washington had experienced this kind of scrutiny before, though usually under different circumstances. Growing up in Chicago, he had learned to recognize different types of stares: the hostile glares of whites who resented black people in their neighborhoods, the curious looks of children who had been taught to fear but could not help being fascinated, the clinical observation of those who viewed black people as specimens rather than individuals. What he saw in these German faces was closest to that last category, a kind of anthropological interest that was dehumanizing in its intensity. Lieutenant Thompson had established a temporary command post in one of the less damaged buildings facing the square. He emerged now, clipboard in hand, to conduct an assessment of the civilian population and begin the process of establishing occupation protocols. Behind him came Sergeant Morrison, who would serve as his second in this operation. Thompson surveyed the assembled civilians with a professional eye, noting the predominance of women and children, the obvious signs of malnutrition and stress, the wary, fearful expressions. He had performed this duty multiple times in other towns, and he knew the next steps would be crucial for establishing the kind of relationship that would allow the occupation to proceed smoothly. He stepped forward, and the crowd instinctively moved back several paces. Thompson stopped, aware that his very presence was causing a fear reaction disproportionate to anything he had actually done. He cleared his throat and began to speak in careful German, words he had learned phonetically for exactly this purpose. "I am Lieutenant Thompson of the United States Army. We are here to maintain order and provide for the basic needs of civilians. There will be a registration process for all remaining residents. Food supplies will be distributed beginning tomorrow. Anyone with medical emergencies should report to our aid station." His German was heavily accented but comprehensible, and the fact that he spoke their language at all seemed to surprise the crowd. There was a moment of silence, and then Colonel Muller, the elderly officer who had surrendered the town, stepped forward from the crowd. "I am Colonel Mueller," he said in English, his accent thick but his words clear. "I speak for what remains of our town authority. We will cooperate with your administration." Thompson nodded acknowledgement. "Colonel Mueller, I will need to meet with you and any other remaining officials to discuss procedures. Can you arrange this?" "Of course, Lieutenant, within the hour, if that suits you." "That will be satisfactory. Sergeant Morrison here will coordinate with you." As Muller and Morrison moved aside to discuss logistics, the crowd began to disperse slowly, people returning to whatever shelter they had found in the ruins. But many lingered, still watching the black soldiers with that same intense curiosity mixed with confusion. It was later that afternoon when the incident occurred that would become the talk of the town and fundamentally shift the dynamics of the occupation. A group of women, including Frau Schultz and several of her neighbors, had gathered near what remained of the town's central water pump. Water service had been disrupted by the bombardment, and the old manual pump had become a crucial resource and therefore a natural gathering place for civilian women. Private Caldwell had been assigned to guard duty near this pump to prevent any potential incidents and to ensure equitable distribution of water among the civilian population. He stood several yards away, rifle slung over his shoulder, trying to appear alert but not threatening. The women at the pump kept glancing in his direction, whispering to each other, occasionally falling into nervous silence when he looked their way. Finally, one of the older women, Frau Hilde Richter, aged 56, detached herself from the group and approached him. Caldwell straightened, uncertain what to expect. The woman stopped a few feet away, wringing her hands nervously, her weathered face showing a mixture of fear and determination. "Excuse me," she said in halting English, "I must to ask you question." Caldwell nodded cautiously. "Yes, ma'am?" The woman looked back at her companions, as if gathering courage from their presence, then turned back to him. What she said next would echo through the town and remain a story told for generations. "Is it true," she asked with complete seriousness, "that you have tail?" For a moment Caldwell simply stared at her, certain he had misunderstood. "Excuse me?" "A tail," the woman repeated, making a gesture behind her back. "We are told that your people have tails, like monkeys. Is this true?" The absurdity of the question hung in the air between them. Caldwell felt a complex surge of emotions, anger at the dehumanizing propaganda that would make someone believe such nonsense, pity for people so thoroughly misled, and an almost hysterical urge to laugh at the sheer ridiculousness of the situation. Behind Frau Richter, the other women watched intently, and Caldwell realized with growing disbelief that they were genuinely waiting for his answer, that they actually considered this a serious question requiring clarification. He took a slow breath, choosing his words carefully. "No, ma'am. I don't have a tail. None of us do. That's not true. Someone lied to you." The woman's face showed such profound confusion that it was almost comical. "But we were told by authorities, by scientists. It was in the newspapers, in the schools." "It was a lie," Caldwell repeated, his voice gentle despite the absurdity of having to explain his own humanity. "I'm just a person, same as you. I bleed red, I feel cold and heat, I get hungry and tired. No tail. No different from any other soldier here except for the color of my skin." Frau Richter turned back to her companions and relayed this information in rapid German. Caldwell could see the skepticism in their faces, the difficulty they were having accepting that what they had been taught was utterly false. One of the younger women in the group, barely out of her teens, shook her head vehemently, clearly unwilling to abandon the propaganda she had grown up with. Then something happened that would define the character of the occupation and become a defining moment in Schweinfurt's post-conflict history. Frau Schultz, the factory worker who had been terrified of the black soldiers' arrival, stepped forward from the group. "Prove it," she said in German, then repeated in broken English. "Prove it. Show us you have no tail." Caldwell stared at her, incredulous. "Ma'am, I'm not going to take off my uniform to prove I'm human." But Frau Schultz was insistent, and now several other women were nodding, caught between their indoctrinated beliefs and the evidence of their eyes. The situation was escalating from absurd to potentially confrontational, and Caldwell felt completely out of his depth. It was at this moment that Sergeant Morrison approached, having been alerted by another soldier that something unusual was developing at the water pump. He quickly assessed the situation, noting the agitated civilians, Caldwell's bewildered expression, and the general atmosphere of tense confusion. "What's going on here, Private?" Morrison asked. Caldwell's face showed his embarrassment. Sergeant, these ladies want me to prove I don't have a tail. Morrison's eyebrows rose sharply. They want you to what? They think we have tails, Sarge, like we're monkeys or something. That's what they were told. And now they want proof that we're actually human. For a long moment, Morrison said nothing, his face cycling through the same emotions Caldwell had experienced. Anger, pity, disbelief. Then something shifted in his expression. When he spoke, his voice carried a quality that made Caldwell think of his grandfather, a man who had survived decades of oppression with his dignity intact through a combination of strategic patience and profound inner strength. "Ladies," Morrison said in his careful German, "I understand you have been taught many things about people like us. I understand you believed what you were told because you trusted those who told you. But I will not order my soldier to undress to prove his humanity. What I will do is this." He gestured toward the building where their unit had established headquarters. "We will set up a medical station. Our doctor, Captain Williams, is also a black man. He is a graduate of Meharry Medical College in Tennessee. He has treated hundreds of injured soldiers, saved dozens of lives. Tomorrow we will offer medical services to civilians who need them. You can see for yourselves that our doctor is a skilled professional, not an animal. You can observe our soldiers conducting themselves as disciplined military personnel, and perhaps, through your own observations, you will come to understand that what you were told was a lie designed to make you hate and fear people you had never met." Morrison's words were translated among the women, and slowly the aggressive insistence began to drain from their postures. Frau Weber, who had been watching from the periphery, felt something crack inside her, some wall she had not even realized she had built. The sergeant's calm refusal to participate in his own dehumanization, combined with his gentle acknowledgement of their confused state, struck her as more powerful than any angry denunciation would have been. Frau Richter, the older woman who had asked the initial question, seemed to age further. As the reality of how thoroughly she had been deceived began to sink in, she looked at Caldwell with new eyes, seeing for perhaps the first time not a fearsome other, but a young man in uniform, far from home, doing his duty. "I am sorry," she said quietly in English, and the simple apology carried the weight of a crumbling worldview. The incident at the water pump spread through the town with remarkable speed. By evening, virtually every remaining resident had heard some version of the story, and opinions varied widely on what it meant. Some, particularly older residents and those with more education, began to seriously question what else they had been told that might be equally false. Others, especially those most deeply committed to the previous ideology, dismissed the entire incident as American propaganda or as evidence that these particular soldiers were exceptions. But something fundamental had shifted. The black soldiers had not responded to the deeply offensive question with anger or humiliation tactics. They had responded with patient humanity, and this response proved far more effective at challenging prejudice than any display of force could have been. That evening, Lieutenant Thompson gathered his senior non-commissioned officers to discuss the situation. They met in what had once been a merchant's shop, now serving as their operations center. In addition to Morrison and Hayes, Corporal Washington and several other ranking soldiers attended. "Gentlemen," Thompson began, "I've heard about the incident at the water pump. I want to make something clear about how we're going to handle this occupation. We all know what we've faced back home. We all know what we face even in our own military. We're here in Germany, occupying people who were taught we're subhuman, and some of them still believe it." He paused, looking at each man in turn. "It would be easy to be angry. It would be justified to be angry. But we have an opportunity here to prove something important, not just to these German civilians, but to the white officers who are watching how we handle this assignment. We're going to do our jobs with absolute professionalism. We're going to treat these civilians with the dignity they haven't yet learned to give us. We're going to show them through our actions that everything they were taught was a lie." Sergeant Hayes spoke up, his deep voice thoughtful. "Lieutenant, with respect, some of these folks aren't going to change their minds no matter what we do. They're too committed to their beliefs." "You're right, Sergeant. Some won't change, but some will, especially the children. And those who do change will remember for the rest of their lives that it was black American soldiers who showed them how human beings should treat each other, even enemies, even occupiers." Corporal Washington added. "It's a heavy burden, sir, having to prove our humanity while also doing occupation duty." "It is," Thompson agreed. "It's unfair and it's exhausting and it's something no one should have to do, but it's the situation we're in, and I believe we can make something meaningful out of it." The men nodded, understanding the weight of what their lieutenant was asking. They had all volunteered for military service, despite knowing they would face discrimination. They had all chosen to serve a country that did not always acknowledge their full citizenship, and now they were being asked to demonstrate grace under circumstances that would test the patience of saints. Over the following days, the pattern established by Morrison's response at the water pump continued to define the occupation. When a young boy threw rocks at soldiers, instead of punishment, he was given chocolate and asked if he was hungry. When elderly women struggled to move rubble from their homes, soldiers volunteered to help after their duty hours ended. When the makeshift medical station opened and Captain Williams began treating civilians, people who came expecting to find a brute discovered instead a soft-spoken physician who treated their ailments with genuine care. Frau Weber brought her younger daughter to the medical station 3 days after the water pump incident. The child, 10-year-old Liesel, had developed a persistent cough that terrified her mother, who had seen too many people succumb to respiratory illness in the poorly heated shelters where they now lived. Weber approached the station with trepidation, her ingrained prejudices warring with her desperation to get help for her child. Captain Elijah Williams was 34 years old, one of a small number of black physicians serving in the military. He had graduated from Meharry Medical College in 1936, one of only 2 medical schools in the American South that accepted black students at that time. He had been a practicing physician in Nashville for 6 years before being drafted in 1942, and he had spent the past 3 years treating wounded soldiers under conditions that would have broken many men. When Frau Weber entered the medical station, Williams looked up from the supplies he was organizing and smiled warmly. "Good afternoon," he said in German that was even more heavily accented than Morrison's. "You have brought your daughter for treatment." Weber nodded, pushing Liesel gently forward. The girl clung to her mother's skirt, staring at the black doctor with wide, fearful eyes. Williams crouched down to the child's level, bringing himself to her height rather than looming over her. "Hello, young lady. My name is Captain Williams. I'm a doctor, which means I help people feel better when they're sick. Your mother tells me you have a cough. May I listen to your chest to see if I can help you?" He spoke slowly in German, his accent transforming some words in ways that might have been comical under other circumstances. But his manner was so gentle, his expression so kind, that Liesel found herself relaxing slightly. The examination was thorough and professional. Williams listened to the girl's lungs, checked her throat, took her temperature. Throughout the process, he kept up a stream of gentle conversation, asking about her favorite games, telling her about the daughter he had back home in Tennessee who was close to her age. "She has bronchitis," Williams finally told Frau Weber, "but it is not yet severe. I can give you medicine that will help, and I will show you breathing exercises that will make her more comfortable. She will recover, but she needs rest and better nutrition if possible." He prepared a packet of sulfur drugs, carefully explaining the dosage, and demonstrated the breathing exercises. As Weber prepared to leave, medicine clutched in her hand like precious treasure, she paused. "Dr. Williams," she said haltingly, "I must tell you something. When I came here, I was afraid. I believed things about you and your men that I now see were lies. I am ashamed that I believed these things." Williams nodded gravely. "Frau Weber, you believed what you were taught by people you trusted. The shame belongs to those who lied to you, not to you for believing them. What matters now is that you see the truth, and that you help your neighbors see it too." This interaction, like the incident at the water pump, rippled through the community. Women who had been terrified to approach the medical station began to come, first hesitantly, then in increasing numbers. They found their ailments treated with the same care that would be given to anyone, their questions answered patiently, their dignity respected. Not everyone was convinced. There remained a core group of residents, perhaps 20 or 30 people, who refused to acknowledge what was happening before their eyes. They continued to insist that the black soldiers were an aberration, that the propaganda had been essentially correct, even if some details had been exaggerated. These holdouts avoided all contact with the American forces, subsisting on whatever they could scavenge rather than accept food distributions. Among this resistant group was Franz Dietrich, a 47-year-old former party official who had lost his position when the town administration collapsed, but had not lost his commitment to the ideology. Dietrich had been too old and medically unfit for military service, and he had spent the years of conflict in civilian administration, enforcing ideological conformity and reporting neighbors who expressed doubtful sentiments. The arrival of the American forces, especially the black soldiers, represented to him not just a military occupation, but a fundamental assault on his understanding of reality. Dietrich had begun holding secret meetings with like-minded residents, gathering in the cellar of a partially destroyed building to share their grievances and reinforce their sense that they were the ones who truly understood the situation. On April 15th, 8 days after the black soldiers arrived, Dietrich decided to take action. He approached the American headquarters just as morning formations were ending, a written petition in his hand. Lieutenant Thompson was reviewing duty assignments with Sergeant Morrison when a soldier announced that a civilian was demanding to speak with the commanding officer. Dietrich stood in the doorway, his posture radiating hostility despite his physically weakened state. Thompson gestured for him to enter and indicated a chair, but Dietrich refused to sit. "I have come to lodge a formal complaint," Dietrich announced in English. "The presence of these soldiers in our town is an insult. It violates the customs of civilized warfare. I demand they be replaced with proper occupation forces." Thompson kept his face carefully neutral. "I see. And what exactly is your complaint, Herr Dietrich?" "These men are not suitable for occupation duty. They are not of appropriate quality to interact with our population. It is a deliberate humiliation." "Herr Dietrich," Thompson said slowly, "these soldiers have conducted themselves with complete professionalism. They have treated civilians with respect. They have provided medical care and food distribution. What specifically have they done that you find objectionable?" Dietrich's face reddened. "It is what they are, not what they have done. Surely you must understand this." Thompson stood, his height and bearing suddenly emphasizing his authority. "What I understand, Herr Dietrich, is that you are a defeated enemy who is in no position to make demands about who occupies your territory. What I also understand is that you have been so thoroughly indoctrinated with lies that you cannot recognize human decency when you see it. These soldiers will remain. They will continue their duties. And you will either accept this reality or you will face consequences for interfering with occupation operations. Do I make myself clear?" It was the first time Thompson had spoken with open force, and the effect was striking. Dietrich took an involuntary step backward, his confidence crumbling in the face of unambiguous authority. He opened his mouth as if to argue, then thought better of it. Without another word, he turned and left. After he had gone, Morrison let out a low whistle. "That's going to cause talk, Lieutenant." "Let it," Thompson replied. "There's a difference between being understanding toward confused civilians and tolerating active hostility. That man isn't confused. He's committed to his prejudices, and he needed to understand that we're in charge here, not him." The confrontation with Dietrich marked a turning point in the occupation's dynamic. For the residents who had been slowly warming to the American presence, Thompson's firm handling of the former official sent a message that the black soldiers were not seeking approval, but were simply doing their jobs with authority. For those still resistant, it demonstrated that the Americans would not be manipulated or intimidated. The following Sunday, something remarkable occurred that would become one of the most remembered incidents of the occupation period. The town's church, while damaged, was still partially functional. An elderly priest, Father Christoph Bauer, had continued holding services throughout the conflict, ministering to a dwindling congregation in a sanctuary that now had sky visible through holes in the roof. Father Bauer was 71 years old, and he carried the complicated history of the church during the regime period. He had not been a resistance fighter, had not openly defied the authorities, but neither had he fully embraced the ideology. He had maintained his ministry as best he could in circumstances that often required moral compromise, and he lived with the guilt of things left unsaid and undone. On the Sunday after Dietrich's confrontation, Father Bauer stood before his small congregation of perhaps 40 people and began his sermon. He spoke about the stranger in the Old Testament, about the requirement to show hospitality even to enemies, about the fundamental dignity of all people as created in the divine image. His voice grew stronger as he spoke, as if years of cautious silence were finally breaking. "We have been taught lies," he declared, his elderly voice echoing in the damaged sanctuary. "We have been told that some people are less than human, that the color of skin determines worth, that we should fear those who are different from us. But I have watched these soldiers who occupy our town. I have seen them share their rations with hungry children. I have seen their doctor treat our sick with care. I have seen them work to repair damage and restore order. And I must tell you honestly, they have shown more Christian charity than we showed to our neighbors whom we allowed to be persecuted and removed from our community." The congregation sat in stunned silence. Such direct acknowledgement of past wrongs was almost unprecedented, especially from a religious figure who had survived the regime period by maintaining careful political neutrality. Unknown to Father Bauer, Corporal Washington had been walking past the church and had paused to listen through the damaged walls. As a preacher's son who had briefly considered seminary before the conflict, Washington was drawn to the sound of religious service. He understood enough German to follow the general thrust of the sermon, and he found himself deeply moved by the old priest's courage in speaking these truths to his congregation. When the service ended and congregants began to leave, Washington was still standing outside. Father Bauer emerged to find the black soldier waiting, and for a moment, the two men simply looked at each other across the divide of language, race, and circumstance. "Your sermon," Washington said in his careful German, "it was brave. Thank you." Father Bauer's eyes filled with tears. "It was not brave. Brave would have been speaking such truths years ago when it might have mattered. This is merely honesty arriving far too late." "It matters now," Washington assured him. "It matters to these people who are trying to understand what was true and what was lies." The old priest placed a weathered hand on Washington's shoulder, and in that gesture, something fundamental shifted between occupier and occupied, between those who had been demonized and those who had been taught to demonize. They stood together for a moment in the spring sunshine, filtering through the ruins of war. Two men recognizing in each other a shared humanity that propaganda had tried so desperately to deny. Word of Father Bauer's sermon spread quickly, and its effect on the community was profound. For many residents, the priest's words gave them permission to acknowledge what they were increasingly seeing with their own eyes, that the black soldiers were not monsters, but men, and that the ideology they had been taught was built on a foundation of lies. Young Greta Hoffmann, the 19-year-old nurse's aide, found herself particularly affected. She had spent weeks watching the soldiers from a distance, her defensive hostility gradually eroding in the face of repeated evidence that contradicted everything she had been taught. Father Bauer's sermon provided a framework for understanding her confusion, and she made a decision that would have been unthinkable just weeks earlier. She approached the medical station where Captain Williams was treating patients and asked if she could volunteer her services. Williams, surprised but pleased, welcomed her offer. Over the following weeks, Hoffmann worked alongside the black medical personnel, her nursing skills proving valuable in treating the stream of civilians who came for care. The experience of working side by side with men she had been taught to fear transformed her understanding more profoundly than any number of sermons or lectures could have. As April gave way to May, and the European conflict reached its final conclusion, life in Schweinfurt began to take on new rhythms. The immediate chaos of occupation settled into routines. Food distribution became systematic. Basic services began to be restored. The process of denazification, of identifying and removing those most responsible for regime crimes, moved forward under American supervision. The black soldiers remained central to these operations, and their consistent professionalism continued to challenge and change attitudes. Private Caldwell, who had been the subject of the absurd tail question, found himself becoming something of a favorite among local children. He had discovered that chocolate bars from his rations were powerful tools for building bridges, and he spent his off-duty hours teaching kids basic English words and playing improvised games in the rubble-strewn streets. Frau Weber's daughters, Liesel and her older sister Anna, aged 14, were among the children who gravitated toward the American soldiers. Liesel, her bronchitis cured by Captain William's medicine, had lost her fear entirely and would greet Caldwell with enthusiastic waves whenever she saw him. Anna, more reserved and still processing the discrepancy between what she had been taught and what she was experiencing, nonetheless found herself drawn to the soldier's presence. One afternoon in mid-May, Anna approached Caldwell hesitantly as he stood guard duty near a supply depot. She carried a small package wrapped in cloth. "Excuse me," she said in halting English. "I have made something for thank you." She unwrapped the cloth to reveal a small carved wooden figure of a bird. The carving was simple but skillfully done, and Caldwell realized it represented a significant gift in circumstances where resources were scarce. "Your brother made this?" he asked, assuming the carving required skills beyond what a 14-year-old girl would typically possess. Anna shook her head. "I make it. My father teach me carving before he go to military. He not come back." The simple statement carried the weight of thousands of similar stories. Caldwell took the carving gently, turning it in his hands to appreciate the craftsmanship. "This is beautiful," he said sincerely. "Thank you. I will keep it always." Anna smiled shyly, then asked a question that revealed how much attitudes had shifted. "When you go back to America, will you tell people about us, that we not all bad?" Caldwell crouched down so his eyes were level with hers. "I will tell them that I met German people who were confused and scared, but who learned to see past lies. I will tell them about a girl who carved beautiful birds and gave one to a soldier from far away. Yes, I will tell them." This interaction, like so many others during those weeks, illustrated the transformation occurring on both sides. The German civilians were learning that the black soldiers were not the monsters they had been told to fear. But, equally importantly, the soldiers were learning that even people indoctrinated with the most absurd propaganda could recognize truth when confronted with it, consistently and patiently. Not all interactions were so positive. There were incidents of theft from American supplies, accusations of misconduct that had to be investigated, and the constant underlying tension of occupier and occupied. But these problems occurred no more frequently with the black soldiers than with white occupation forces in other towns, and they were handled with the same mixture of firmness and fairness that characterized the unit's overall approach. Sergeant Hayes had become the unofficial mayor of the supply operation, coordinating the distribution of food, fuel, and other necessities to the civilian population. His mechanical skills had proven invaluable in getting the town's basic infrastructure functioning again, and he spent long hours working alongside German civilians to restore water pumps, repair electrical systems where possible, and generally make life more livable. One day in late May, Hayes was working on a particularly stubborn pump mechanism when Franz Dietrich, the former party official who had lodged the complaint against the occupation forces, approached. Hayes looked up warily, expecting another confrontation. But Dietrich's demeanor had changed. The hostile confidence had been replaced by something more defeated and contemplative. He stood watching Hayes work for several minutes before speaking. "You are very skilled with machinery," he finally said in English. Hayes continued working but nodded acknowledgement. "Been fixing things since I was a kid. Good with my hands." "In my country," Dietrich said slowly, "we would not have allowed someone of your race to do skilled work. We believed you were capable only of simple labor." Hayes stopped working and looked directly at Dietrich. "And what do you believe now?" Dietrich was silent for a long moment. "I believe that I have been a fool, that I have wasted years of my life believing and promoting lies, that I have contributed to terrible wrongs because I was too arrogant to question what I was told." It was as close to an apology as Hayes was likely to receive from such a man, and he recognized it as such. He could have responded with anger or with satisfaction at the man's admission of error. Instead, he simply nodded and returned to his work. "Well," Hayes said, We all have to live with what we've done. Question is what you do from here. Dietrich nodded slowly and walked away. Hayes never saw him again, as the former official left Schweinfurt shortly thereafter, moving to another region where his past was less well known. But the interaction stayed with Hayes as an example of how completely the consistent humanity of his unit had undermined even the most committed adherents of racist ideology. As spring turned to summer, the occupation regime began to shift. Some of the black soldiers were reassigned to other duties or began the process of returning to the United States. Lieutenant Thompson received orders in early June to move his unit to a different location, and the process of handing over Schweinfurt to a different occupation force began. The night before the unit was scheduled to depart, the town's residents organized an impromptu gathering in the central square. It was not precisely a celebration, as the circumstances were still too difficult for genuine festivity, but it was a recognition of what had transpired over the past 2 months. Father Bauer offered a prayer of blessing for the soldiers' safe journey home. Frau Weber presented Lieutenant Thompson with a small book containing names and messages from residents, expressions of gratitude and acknowledgement of how their presence had changed hearts and minds. Even young Greta Hoffmann, who had come so far from her initial hostility, spoke briefly about what she had learned working alongside the medical staff. Thompson accepted these tokens with visible emotion. "We came here as occupiers," he said through a translator, "and we leave as witnesses to the power of truth over lies. You were taught to hate and fear us, and you have learned instead to see us as fellow human beings. We were angry at the prejudice we encountered, and we have learned that prejudice can be overcome through patient demonstration of our shared humanity. I hope you will remember us and what happened here, and I hope you will teach your children the lessons we learned together." The next morning, the convoy rolled out of Schweinfurt amid waves and calls of farewell from civilians who had once been terrified at the prospect of black occupation forces. Sergeant Morrison sat in the lead truck again, as he had on the day they arrived, but his thoughts were different now. They had accomplished something significant here, something that went beyond military occupation and touched on questions of human dignity and the possibility of transformation. Private Caldwell carried Anna's carved bird in his pocket, a tangible reminder of connections made across chasms of race and nation. Corporal Washington had promised Father Bauer that he would write to him, and he would keep that promise, maintaining a correspondence that would last for years. Captain Williams had been thanked by more patients than he could count, many of whom admitted they had come expecting an incompetent imposter and had found instead a skilled physician who treated them with care. The white officers who had been observing the occupation were forced to acknowledge, even if only in their private reports, that the black soldiers had performed their duties exceptionally well. The expected problems had not materialized. The civilians who had been predicted to react violently to black occupation forces had instead been transformed into something approaching allies. It was a practical demonstration that competence and humanity transcended race, though it would be many years before such lessons would be broadly accepted in American military policy. As the convoy moved through the German countryside toward their next assignment, Hayes broke into one of the spirituals he often sang, and other soldiers joined in. The song, born from centuries of oppression and suffering, now became a celebration of dignity maintained and humanity affirmed in the face of absurd prejudice. The war in Europe had officially ended on May 8th, less than a month after the black soldiers had first arrived in Schweinfurt. In the years that followed, Germany would undergo profound transformation as the occupying powers sought to rebuild the nation and purge it of the ideology that had led to such catastrophe. The process would be long, difficult, and incomplete, with some people embracing change while others clung to discredited beliefs. But in one small town, a group of African American soldiers had demonstrated something powerful about the nature of prejudice and its potential defeat. They had faced people who believed they were subhuman, who had literally asked if they had tails, and they had responded not with anger or cruelty, but with patient, consistent humanity. They had proven through their actions that the propaganda was false, that dignity and competence were not determined by skin color, that people who had been taught to hate could learn to see beyond their indoctrination. Frau Weber kept the medicine bottle that had held the sulfur drugs which cured her daughter's bronchitis. She would show it to visitors for decades afterward, explaining how a black American doctor had treated her child when she had been too frightened to approach at first, believing the lies she had been taught. As her daughters grew and had children of their own, she would tell them the story of the occupation and the lessons she had learned, ensuring that the next generation would not repeat the mistakes of hers. Hannah became a teacher in the rebuilt German education system, and she always kept the mate to the wooden bird she had carved for Caldwell displayed in her classroom. When students asked about it, she would tell them about meeting an American soldier who had treated her with kindness when her country had taught her to fear him, and she would use the story to discuss the dangers of propaganda and the importance of judging people as individuals. Young Greta Hoffmann pursued formal nursing training after the war and eventually became a hospital administrator. She never forgot her weeks working alongside Captain Williams and his medical staff, and she would cite that experience as formative in her decision to dedicate her life to healing. She remained in contact with several of the soldiers through letters, and when racial integration in America finally became a major public issue in the 1950s and 60s, she would write letters of support, telling anyone who would listen about the extraordinary men who had occupied her town and transformed her understanding of human worth. Father Bauer lived until 1954, and in his final years, he often spoke of his sermon that Sunday and the conversation afterward with Corporal Washington. He viewed it as a small redemption for his years of silence during the regime, a moment when he had finally spoken necessary truths regardless of consequence. The church he had served was rebuilt in 1951, and at his request, a small plaque was placed near the entrance commemorating the American soldiers who had occupied the town and demonstrated through their actions the Christian principles of dignity and compassion. Not everyone changed, of course. Some residents maintained their prejudices, finding ways to explain away what had happened or to minimize its significance. Some moved away rather than confront the implications of their changing views. Some simply went silent on the topic, neither acknowledging transformation nor defending their previous beliefs. Human beings are complex, and ideology has deep roots that are not easily extracted. But enough people changed, enough hearts and minds were opened, that Schweinfurt became something of a local legend in the post-war period. Other towns had been occupied by black American soldiers, but few had undergone quite so dramatic a transformation from fear and hostility to acceptance and even affection. Scholars studying post-war Germany would occasionally visit to interview residents about their experiences, adding to the historical record of how ordinary people navigated the collapse of an ideological system and the difficult process of recognizing their complicity in great wrongs. For the soldiers themselves, the experience of Schweinfurt became one they would carry for the rest of their lives. They had faced absurd prejudice and had defeated it not through force, but through the simple consistency of their humanity. They had been asked to prove they did not have tails, and they had responded by demonstrating through action after action that they were men of honor, skill, and compassion. Sergeant Morrison returned to Philadelphia after his discharge in 1946 and resumed his work with the railroad, though eventually he moved into management positions that had been closed to black workers before the conflict. He married in 1948 and raised 3 children, telling them stories of his military service that emphasized both the discrimination he faced and the moments of connection that proved such prejudice could be overcome. He lived until 1987, long enough to see the civil rights movement transform American society, though not long enough to see the election of the nation's first black president. Private Caldwell returned to Georgia and used military educational benefits to attend college, becoming a teacher like Corporal Washington had been before the conflict. He taught history to black students in segregated schools through the 1950s and 60s, and he always included units on the military service of African Americans, making sure his students understood that their people had served with honor despite facing discrimination. He kept Anna's carved bird on his desk throughout his teaching career, and it remained one of his most treasured possessions. He passed away in 1992. Corporal Washington returned to Chicago and to teaching, becoming an advocate for educational reform and racial justice. He wrote extensively about his military experiences, including several articles that appeared in black newspapers and magazines. His correspondence with Father Bauer continued until the priest's death, and Washington kept those letters as reminders that human connection could transcend the barriers of race, nation, and past wrongs. He became a professor of history at a historically black university in 1958 and taught there until his retirement in 1978. He lived until 2001, witnessing the dawn of a new century and the continued struggles for racial justice. Technical Sergeant Hayes returned to Detroit and resumed his work as a mechanic, eventually opening his own repair shop in 1952. His business became successful, partly because of his skill and partly because of his reputation as an honest tradesman who treated all customers fairly. He hired both black and white mechanics, creating one of the first integrated workplaces in his neighborhood. His characteristic optimism never faded, even through the difficult years of the civil rights struggle. He lived until 1996, long enough to see Detroit undergo its own transformations and challenges. Lieutenant Thompson pursued further education after the military, earning a law degree and becoming one of the relatively few black attorneys in the 1950s. He worked primarily on civil rights cases, representing individuals who faced discrimination in housing, employment, and public accommodations. His military experience, particularly his time in Schweinfurt, had convinced him that change was possible even in the face of entrenched prejudice, and this conviction sustained him through years of difficult legal battles. He became a judge in 1968 and served on the bench until his retirement in 1985. He passed away in 2003. Captain Williams returned to his medical practice in Nashville, where he became a pillar of the black community and an advocate for healthcare access. He established a clinic that provided low-cost medical care to underserved populations, both black and white, remembering how his treatment of German civilians had broken down barriers of prejudice. He trained younger black physicians, encouraging them to see their profession as not just a career, but as a tool for social transformation. He lived until 1998, having treated thousands of patients over his long career. The question of why the Schweinfurt occupation succeeded so well in changing attitudes, when other similar situations did not, has interested historians for decades. Several factors seem to have contributed. The soldiers themselves were carefully disciplined and professionally competent, traits that were immediately observable to the civilian population. Lieutenant Thompson's leadership established clear expectations for behavior that emphasized dignity and restraint, even in the face of provocation. The timing mattered as well. The German population in April and May of 1945 was exhausted, traumatized, and increasingly aware that much of what they had been told was false. The regime's collapse had already begun to create space for doubt about official ideology. The black soldiers arrived at a moment when people were psychologically ready to have their assumptions challenged. The specific nature of the propaganda also played a role. The claims about African Americans having tails and being subhuman were so extreme and so obviously false upon direct observation that they were relatively easy to disprove. More subtle forms of prejudice, the kind that acknowledged basic humanity while still maintaining hierarchies of worth, might have been more resistant to change. The absurdity of the lies made their refutation more complete. But perhaps most importantly, the soldiers' response to prejudice was crucial. They could have reacted with justified anger to being asked if they had tails. They could have used their power as occupiers to humiliate those who had believed such things. Instead, they responded with patience and grace, understanding that these civilians had been victims of propaganda, even as they had also been complicit in supporting the system that produced such propaganda. This combination of factors created what social scientists might now call a perfect storm for attitude change. The extreme nature of the prejudice, the obvious evidence contradicting it, the receptivity of the population due to broader ideological collapse, and the dignified response of those targeted by the prejudice all worked together to produce genuine transformation. The story of Schweinfurt also illustrates the complex relationship between individual prejudice and systemic ideology. Many of the German civilians who asked about tails or who initially feared the black soldiers were not personally malicious. They had simply accepted what they had been taught by authorities they had been conditioned to trust. When presented with clear evidence that contradicted these teachings, many were capable of change. This does not excuse their earlier acceptance of dehumanizing ideology, but it does suggest that individuals are not always as fixed in their prejudices as we might assume. At the same time, the story shows the limits of individual transformation. Not everyone in Schweinfurt changed their views. Some, like Franz Dietrich, acknowledged error only after it had become undeniable, and then retreated from the community rather than fully confronting their complicity. Others maintained their prejudices despite all evidence, finding ways to explain away or minimize what they observed. Personal change, even in circumstances as dramatic as those in Schweinfurt, is never universal or complete. For the African American soldiers, the experience of Schweinfurt was both validating and frustrating. It was validating because it proved that prejudice could be overcome, that people who started from positions of extreme racism could learn to see them as fully human. But it was also frustrating because they returned to an America where they still faced discrimination, where their military service did not guarantee them equal treatment, where many white Americans maintained prejudices not that different from what they had encountered in Germany. This contradiction, that they could transform attitudes among former enemies more easily than among their fellow citizens, was not lost on the veterans. Many became active in the civil rights movement, drawing on their military experience to argue that if German civilians could learn to see past racist propaganda, surely American whites could do the same. The fact that they had proven their humanity and competence in the most extreme circumstances imaginable became a powerful argument against continued segregation and discrimination. The story also resonates with broader questions about propaganda, ideology, and truth. The German civilians in Schweinfurt had been subjected to years of intensive indoctrination, using all the tools of modern media and educational systems. The propaganda had been pervasive, constant, and reinforced by authority figures at every level. Yet, despite this thorough conditioning, direct personal experience proved capable of breaking through the lies. This suggests something both hopeful and cautionary about human nature. It is hopeful because it indicates that people are not entirely prisoners of ideology, that direct experience and evidence can overcome even intensive indoctrination. It is cautionary because it also shows how easily people can be led to believe absurd lies when those lies are promoted by trusted authorities and repeated constantly. The question of what it takes to deprogram people who have been indoctrinated remains relevant today. The Schweinfurt example suggests that several elements are necessary. There must be clear, undeniable evidence that contradicts the propaganda. There must be repeated exposure to this evidence over time, not just a single instance. There must be some receptivity on the part of those who have been indoctrinated, some crack in their certainty that allows new information to enter. And perhaps most importantly, those who represent the truth must conduct themselves in ways that reinforce rather than undermine their message. The black soldiers in Schweinfurt succeeded not just because they showed up, but because they consistently demonstrated through their actions that the propaganda about them was false. Had they behaved poorly, had they abused their power as occupiers, they would have confirmed rather than challenged existing prejudices. Their discipline and humanity were essential to changing minds. This places a heavy burden on those who are the targets of prejudice, essentially requiring them to prove their humanity to those who deny it. This burden is profoundly unfair, and the soldiers themselves recognized this even as they shouldered it. Yet they also understood that in the specific circumstances of Schweinfurt, they had an opportunity to create change, and they chose to seize that opportunity despite its costs. Decades after the occupation ended, several of the soldiers and German civilians were brought together for a documentary film project about the period. The reunion, filmed in 1987 in Germany, was emotionally powerful for all involved. Frau Weber, now in her 80s, met Sergeant Morrison again and embraced him with tears flowing freely. Young Greta Hoffmann, now a dignified older woman, spoke at length with Captain Williams about how their time working together had shaped her entire subsequent career. Perhaps most striking was the conversation between Anna, now in her 50s and a grandmother herself, and James Caldwell. She had kept the other carved bird all these years and now presented it to him so he would have the matching pair. They sat together, and talked about how that small carved gift had represented a breakthrough moment for both of them, Anna learning to see past her indoctrination and Caldwell learning that even those who had been taught to hate could choose differently. The documentary captured these reunions and the reflections of those involved about what had happened in Schweinfurt. One exchange in particular stood out. The interviewer asked Morrison whether he felt angry about having to prove his humanity to people who should never have doubted it in the first place. Morrison thought carefully before responding. "Of course I felt angry, we all did. It was humiliating and exhausting and unfair, but we also understood that anger alone wouldn't change anything. These people had been lied to their whole lives. They didn't know any better until we showed them. Was it fair that we had to teach them? No. But it was the situation we were in, and we made the choice to respond with dignity instead of with the same hate they had been taught to feel toward us. And you know what? It worked. Not perfectly, not with everyone. But it worked well enough that 40 years later we can sit here together and talk about it as human beings who respect each other." This reflection captured the essential wisdom that had guided the soldiers' conduct during those crucial weeks in April and May of 1945. They had understood that they could not control how others viewed them, but they could control how they responded to that view. They had chosen to respond with patience, professionalism, and humanity, and in doing so, they had changed hearts and minds in ways that force never could have achieved. The legacy of Schweinfurt extends beyond the individuals directly involved. The town itself maintained a memory of this period, with local historians documenting the stories and ensuring they were passed down to subsequent generations. A memorial was eventually established recognizing the African American soldiers who had occupied the town and the role they played in helping residents understand the falsity of racist ideology. When racial tensions erupted in America during the Civil Rights Movement, and again during the social justice protests of later decades, some observers would point to examples like Schweinfurt as evidence that racial prejudice could be overcome. The story became a kind of parable about the power of personal interaction to break down barriers of hate and fear. Of course, the reality is always more complex than any simple parable. The changes that occurred in Schweinfurt happened in a specific context that cannot be easily replicated. The German civilians were a defeated population, receptive to reconsidering their beliefs because their entire political and social system had collapsed. The black soldiers were in a position of authority as occupiers, which gave their actions a weight they might not have had in other circumstances. The particular nature of the propaganda, with its extreme and obviously false claims, made it easier to disprove than more subtle forms of prejudice. Nevertheless, the core insight remains valid. That sustained, personal interaction between people who have been taught to hate each other can break down prejudice if those interactions consistently demonstrate shared humanity. This is neither quick nor easy, and it requires those who are the targets of prejudice to maintain dignity even in the face of insult and dehumanization. But it is possible, as the streets of Schweinfurt in the spring of 1945 clearly demonstrated. The soldiers who served in Schweinfurt were part of a larger story of African American military service that stretched from the Revolutionary period through the present day. At every stage, black soldiers and sailors had volunteered to serve a nation that denied them full citizenship, hoping that their service would help advance the cause of racial justice. From the Buffalo Soldiers of the frontier conflicts to the Tuskegee Airmen of the same global conflict that brought these men to Germany, African Americans had repeatedly proven their courage, competence, and patriotism. Yet progress toward full equality remained frustratingly slow. The military would not fully integrate until President Truman's executive order in 1948, and true racial integration would take even longer to achieve. The civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s would be necessary to dismantle legal segregation, and the struggle against more subtle forms of discrimination would continue for decades beyond that. The men who served in Schweinfurt were part of this long struggle, and their experience there represented a small but significant victory in the larger campaign for human dignity. They had proven in the most dramatic circumstances imaginable that they were not the subhuman creatures that racist propaganda claimed, but rather men of honor, skill, and compassion, who deserved full recognition of their humanity and contributions. As we reflect on this story more than 75 years after the events it describes, several lessons emerge that remain relevant today. First, propaganda and ideological indoctrination can be powerful, leading people to believe absurd falsehoods, but they are not all-powerful. Direct personal experience can break through even intensive conditioning when that experience clearly contradicts what people have been taught. Second, those who are the targets of prejudice face an unfair burden in having to prove their humanity to those who deny it, but accepting this burden strategically can create opportunities for genuine transformation. The Schweinfurt soldiers recognized this and chose dignity over rage with powerful results. Third, change is possible but not inevitable. Some people will adjust their views when confronted with clear evidence that their prejudices are unfounded, but others will cling to their beliefs regardless of evidence. The goal should be to reach those who are reachable, while not being discouraged by those who are not. Fourth, leadership matters enormously in situations where prejudice and conflict intersect. Lieutenant Thompson's clear expectations for his men's conduct, his own example of dignity and professionalism, and his firm handling of hostility from resistors all contributed to the success of the occupation. Good leadership can multiply the positive impact of individual virtue. Fifth, the impacts of individual interactions can extend far beyond the immediate moment. The German civilians who learned to see past racist propaganda in Schweinfurt went on to raise children with different values, creating ripple effects that extended across generations. Similarly, the soldiers who served there drew on the experience throughout their lives as they continued working toward racial justice in America. Finally, history is made not just by grand political movements and famous leaders, but also by ordinary people making choices about how to treat one another in specific circumstances. The decision by Sergeant Morrison to respond to the absurd tail question with patience rather than rage, the decision by Frau Weber to bring her daughter to a black doctor despite her fears, the decision by young Anna to carve a bird for a soldier from a country that had been her enemy. These small human choices accumulated into something larger and more significant than any single individual intended. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.